Sometimes hearing that your attachment style has a name feels like a punch to the heart. Disorganized attachment is often misrepresented in pop culture as chaotic, dramatic, or too much. For women with complex PTSD, this misrepresentation can trigger intense shame. You might hear yourself thinking, am I broken? Am I too much? Am I too complicated of a person? This is shame. And shame often arises not from the attachment style itself, but from how the world sees that attachment style. And that secondary shame can be so heavy, so confusing, and extremely isolating. But here's the truth. Disorganized attachment is not a flaw. It is a survival strategy. I've been saying this on here episode after episode because I really want this to stick for you all. Disorganized attachment style develops when the people that you needed to feel safe were also inconsistent, also overwhelming, and maybe even frightening at times. Your nervous system learned a painful paradox. And that paradox is that closeness can comfort me sometimes, but also it can overwhelm or hurt me. And so today we're going to be exploring how disorganized attachment forms biologically and relationally, how it shows up in adulthood, especially for women with CPTSD, how shame gets amplified by labeling and misrepresenting this attachment style, and how we can begin to reframe the shame and practice self-compassion. Let's dive in. Welcome back, everybody, to Reclaiming Me, a trauma-informed podcast helping women with complex PTSD heal the lasting impact of childhood attachment wounds from parents and caregivers, so you can release people-pleasing and perfectionism and learn to trust in relationships, beginning with the one that you have with yourself. I'm your host, Cindy Payne, therapist, trauma specialist, and a woman who has walked this path both personally and professionally. I am so glad that you returned this week to hear more about the disorganized attachment style. And if this is your first time tuning in, welcome. Today, we're going to get into a really tough topic, but it's a necessary one to address, especially for fellow CPTSD survivors. And that is the disorganized attachment style and the misunderstandings around it. Disorganized attachment is often described as rare, chaotic, or unstable. I can remember when I first received my own CPTSD diagnosis and I was flooded with shame. If you listened to the earlier episodes in this podcast, you'll remember that I shared how I didn't receive my CPTSD diagnosis until I was well into my mid-40s. I was an established therapist with a growing, healthy practice and a mom of 3 emerging adult children and a marriage of almost 25 years. And so when I learned more about the disorganized attachment style, I really kept it at an arm's length because I didn't want to really look at it up close. And I do believe, after a lot of research and talking with other clinicians and my own therapist, that the reason that I felt this shame has a lot to do with the way that it is portrayed in pop culture. So I want you to think about Rebecca Bunch from Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. She's called overly emotional, but Rebecca's behavior reflects a nervous system that learned to respond to contradictory safety and threat. Or Kendall Roy, if you're a Succession fan. He's labeled as manipulative when his attachment system is really navigating unpredictability. Or one of my favorites, Rue from Euphoria. and Susanna Kaysen from Girl Interrupted. They both illustrate beautifully what it's like to have internal conflict misread as personal flaws. Or if you're a Disney fan, Moana. In a subtler sense, Moana navigates closeness and safety, showing us that even subtle push-pull strategies are rooted in survival. For women with CPTSD, this misrepresentation produces something called secondary shame or meta shame. It's the shame about being ashamed of oneself. Research supports this. Main and Solomon found that children with caregivers who were simultaneously safe and frightening developed no coherent attachment strategy. Again, not because of personal defect, but because their environment was unpredictable. And naming this disorganized attachment is not about labeling you as broken. It's about understanding this survival pattern so that it can begin healing. So if this really resonates with you, I invite you to sit back, try to relax as much as you can in this episode, and just take this information in. And hopefully by the end of today, you can practice reframing this attachment style through the lens of love and compassion. So in today's episode, we're going to be covering how disorganized attachment forms biologically and relationally, how it shows up in women, and how to work with shame that arises from labeling and misrepresentation. So, the formation of disorganized attachment develops when the caregiver is both a source of comfort and a source of fear. This approach could bring care at times, or it could trigger stress. This leaves the child in a state of confusion because he or she is receiving conflicting messages about safety. The nervous system interprets this as there is no safe move. Children with this attachment often freeze or collapse in response to a caregiver's presence. They could show contradictory behaviors. So again, wanting closeness, but then resisting it. And on the outside, they can appear dissociated or hypervigilant. So it can really kind of swing both ways. And for women with CPTSD, this early wiring persists into adulthood. So this push-pull dynamic of safety versus fear really becomes embedded in our nervous systems. So if we're looking at it through a neuroscience lens, think about repeated experiences of inconsistency in caregiving and how this heightens the amygdala activation. And remember that the amygdala is in charge of all of the emotions that we're processing in our brain and our body. There is a disruption that is caused in our prefrontal cortex. So it's really challenging for our prefrontal cortex to regulate, which creates a very strong and intense fight, flight, freeze response in adult relationships. So you could be in a potential conflict with your significant other, and a look or a response or a lack of response really signals to the amygdala that, hey, this isn't safe, this is dangerous. So the prefrontal cortex goes offline and it leaves you with an inability to self-regulate. And it just feels really inaccessible, and it can feel really scary and confusing. And again, shameful, which shuts down the ability to make clear, calm decisions. So I want to just share a little personal reflection about my own mixed signals and shame response. Growing up, with my grandparents from a completely different generation, different values, the way that they viewed emotions and talked about emotions, or rather didn't talk about emotions. I know now that my experience was not one-dimensional. As I've mentioned before, my grandfather had such a playful, warm presence most of the time. And these moments where he was playful and warm and present and connected, my nervous system could soften and it could relax and feel joy, and playfulness was allowed. And this wasn't all the time. My grandmother, on the other hand, she was more emotionally distant and sometimes even unpredictable herself. She wasn't intentionally unkind, nor was she intentionally abusive in any way. She was just absent in ways that really mattered the most. And I could remember really connecting with her and having moments of feeling seen by her. And we would be in one of our good phases, as I like to call it, when I was an adolescent. But the minute something would happen that would disrupt any sense of safety or cohesiveness in our family, so usually that entailed something with my mother and her mental illness, I could see the fear response in my grandmother just begin to bubble up. And sometimes this would look like shutting down completely and stonewalling and needing to leave the house for an entire day. And sometimes this would look like frustration that was worked out on us. And if we had needs or questions, or we're just going through something that an adolescent would go through, she could be harsh. She could be distant. She could be really unkind. And again, this is tricky for me to talk about because when I think about my grandmother, I have such deep gratitude, but it was a complicated relationship. All my friends knew her as this fierce woman who had been through so much. You didn't mess with Helen Morse, but she was a hard egg to crack. And so this mixture of the two created a lot of confusion for me. Connection existed, but it was unpredictable. Safety existed, but it was often conditional. The first time I heard disorganized attachment, again, these intense feelings of shame came flooding in. Am I really this unstable? Am I really too much? Am I really too sensitive? I now can recognize that this shame was secondary, right? This was amplified by a societal misunderstanding. My attachment style was not a flaw. It was an adaptation to survive. So let's talk about how this shows up in adult relationships and what happens when shame comes on the scene. So in adult relationships, a disorganized attachment often shows up as a deep longing for closeness while simultaneously fearing it at the same time. Or emotional intensity followed by a withdrawal or dissociation. Difficulty trusting instincts or interpreting partner behavior. Brene Brown uses this acronym called SFD, and that stands for the shitty first draft. And I remember the first time I learned about this, it just resonated with me so deeply. And it's this idea that don't trust the first draft of a story that your brain is telling you, because if you understand that the brain is scanning for danger and just trying to keep you safe, you'll understand that you create a lot of stories. And this idea about not being able to trust your instincts or interpreting or misinterpreting partner behavior, that really gets amplified when you have a history of a disorganized attachment. And this longing for closeness while simultaneously fearing it, I think for me, that can, or has been rather, the most confusing part of all of this. Because the longing for closeness is more of an internal signal, and the fear is displayed on the outside. So that is what this push-pull dynamic can often look like when you are operating from a disorganized attachment. It doesn't feel safe to express the need for closeness. And so you shut down and you shut out oftentimes. The withdrawal, the dissociation, I think for me, that has oftentimes come with the shame that I've experienced after feeling a lot of really intense emotions and not having the tools to express this in a safe way. And again, this was early on for me, but just know that if this is true for you too, that there is hope. So let's jump back in with some pop culture mirrors for you. I referenced Rebecca Bunch in Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. If you've seen that, her internalized trauma was often misread as dramatic. Oof, I think that can be one of the most painful pieces of feedback that complex PTSD survivors can experience. And it can feel like gaslighting at times. We have Kendall Roy in Succession, and Kendall's adaptive strategies are often misread as manipulative. And yes, I do want to note that people can knowingly be doing something and do it anyway that's harmful. And yes, that is manipulation, right? But I think for today's episode, that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about an adaptive strategy in which other people are misreading on the outside as manipulation. So I just wanted to make a clear distinction of that. Rue from Euphoria, such a great show. Her survival-based self-protection is misread as unstable. And I think for women, this is really common. If you look at our history of being institutionalized, this goes back to the 1800s when women could be institutionalized for hysteria. And we'll get into all of this in a later episode, but it's really eye-opening when you look at our history and how we were labeled as crazy, for lack of a better word. And there was something deeper going on underneath. For women with CPTSD, these misrepresentations, all they really do is feed shame. And it's shame about being inconsistent. Shame about needing closeness and fearing it. And shame about surviving the only way possible. So here are some examples. A partner's tone or even a delayed response can trigger physiological fear responses that show up in the body. A nervous system reacts as if the past is happening now. And then this secondary shame emerges and says things like, why can't I just relax? Why do I do this? And so the more we can understand that this is protection based on earlier experiences, then shame can be redirected towards that self-compassion that we talk about on this podcast rather than self-judgment. As I've mentioned on previous episodes, I want to highlight that you can love your caregivers and still acknowledge the trauma. Gratitude for the things that they did for you, for the ways that they provided and connected with you, and deep grief can coexist at the same time. And naming impact doesn't erase love. Our healing is really about creating safety in the present and not trying to go back and rewrite history. I think this is where we can get stuck as complex trauma survivors. And I'll never forget when I was a new mom and I was really struggling deeply with postpartum depression. And my grandparents flew from Texas to Las Vegas, where we were living, to stay with me for a while and help get me back on my feet and help take care of my oldest, just so that I could get my sleep under control again and just really heal from birthing my first child and undergoing a bunch of IVF treatments prior to that. And I was feeling really emotionally vulnerable. And my grandmother had been there long enough that we had kind of created this really safe, loving daily routine where we would walk Ethan in the stroller in the morning and we would have a lot of talks. And so I felt safe at this point to approach her and just share about how some of the earlier childhood trauma that I had experienced had really made it difficult for me to connect with my baby as a new mother. And I was carrying at the time, although I don't think I could have named it at the time, I was carrying so much shame about my postpartum depression and thinking that I didn't deserve to be a mom, that, I had struggled. Maybe the IVF was a sign that I wasn't supposed to have children. And my grandmother was just so confused about the conclusion that I had drawn. And I was able to say to her that I loved and appreciated everything she had done for me. And yet also at the same time, some of her avoidant behaviors and even shaming behaviors had really damaged me. And it was actually a really beautiful moment. I could just get choked up thinking about it right now because she was able to hold that. And she was able to stay curious about my experience. And she was able to work on a repair with me and really own her part in it. And it was just such a beautiful talk about how something really painful in my childhood had the ability to really transform our relationship into a deep one. And shortly after that, she was diagnosed with dementia and we lost that cognitive part of her. But I'm forever grateful for that conversation. And just a disclaimer to the listeners, that's not going to be an option for everybody. That's not going to be safe for everybody. So if that's not available to you at this point in your healing journey, that's okay. Healing is still a viable option and you deserve that. So I just wanted to share that little excerpt because for women with CPTSD, our goal is nervous system integration. And integration, again, is that fancy word for just noticing patterns and offering yourself care and gradually allowing safe closeness. Notice the word is gradual here. So there is hope. And you can do this without the apology from a caregiver or even acknowledging this with a caregiver. Disorganized attachment isn't chaos, it's survival. And when we are in this deep shame and sometimes meta shame, just please remember that shame is misdirected. And when longing and fear coexist, I invite you to pause and ask, what is it that my nervous system is responding to in this moment? And healing begins when we can give that safety to complexity rather than trying to force clarity or fix ourselves. This was a heavy one for me today, but thanks for hanging in there with me. Next week, we'll take a moment to honor the self in the new year. And I'm going to be sharing 5 things that I've changed my own mind about this past year as a CPTSD survivor. And I'll explore how our perspectives evolve and how we can give ourselves permission to shift and grow and reclaim our joy. It's a continuation of attachment work, but it's through the lens of celebration and insight and self-honoring and hope. And I thought it might be a beautiful segue into our 2026, our year of the horse. So if you're into all the woo-woo stuff like me, you'll know that 2025 was the year of the snake. It was about shedding. And 2026 is all about strength and newness and honoring the self. Disorganized attachment tells the story of how you survived, not how broken you are. And naming this pattern is insight, and it's not judgment. So this week, please notice when you're engaging in any moments of push-pull, and please respond with curiosity instead of shame. Attachment patterns, remember, they're not fixed, they're malleable, and with awareness and consistency and safety, especially safety within yourself, change is possible. Thank you for listening today. Please, if you feel so inclined, subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. Leave a review or share it with somebody who might feel seen. I hope you'll tune in this Wednesday for a short midweek reframe, more on disorganized attachment and self-compassion, and how we can meet this push-pull emotion with more kindness. Until next time, take care.